Welcome back to the shop, everyone. This week's video takes place in 2025, week 37, September 8th through 14th, and we're just going to start by taping off these side windows. Reason why we're going to do that is I'm not going to remove them. I don't want to risk breaking them. These are pretty specific windows for the Capri. So we're just going to take this off, and then we are going to just get right into doing some fab work on this car now that we've got it stripped down to pretty much nothing. Alright, so I just got this tool. This is supposed to help with removing paint and material from metal in large areas. As you can see, I got the whole car that I want to repaint, so I'm just testing this out just to see if it does what it's supposed to. And it does, removes the paint, but it takes a long time to remove the paint. Like it took a lot of effort and didn't really clean it up as quick as I was expecting. So we'll have to see, and maybe we can get a different wheel for it or something. I don't know. But as a first test, I mean, it's better than just sandpaper, I guess, and like a orbital. But yeah, not as quick as I would like. So might have to do some work there. Since I was in here, I noticed that the panel from when I was removing the roof got kind of bent, so I'm just going to try and hammer and dolly that out a little bit. But it is kind of in a very tight area, and there's a lot of metal on the backside, so I don't know if I'm actually going to be able to really hammer this out at all. And also what I'm going to do is I'm also just going to grind some of the sharp areas, some of those sharp spot welds that I cut out, straighten up the front lip a little bit, and just kind of tidy everything a little bit as far as the metal's concerned. Yeah, so when I was cutting the roof out, I was a little bit aggressive with the cutoff wheel. So I cut the A pillar, B pillar in a few places. So what I'm going to do is grab my MIG welder. I'm just going to fill in those areas where I cut too deep and then just kind of grind them smooth. That way it, looks like I was never in there. Alright, so now we are starting the main project of why I took the windshield off, why I stripped this down, why I stripped the car down to nothing, and that's to remove or replace the roof. Now we're going to start with the roof replacement by cutting out a ton of this excess roof material, and I mean a ton. As you can see, I'm cutting this back like 2.5 to 3 inches because I don't need all of it. I just need like the edge parts. So yeah, that's what we are getting after right now, using a level just kind of get some straight lines. But then I realized, nothing in here is really actually straight. It's all kind of curved, so just kind of freehanding it, and that'll be sufficient. It doesn't need to be perfect on this first pass. I can clean it up later, but let's just get a good chunk of this removed. Now my first thought was using a grinder is great, but it throws sparks everywhere, makes a massive mess everywhere in the shop. So I was like, what I'm going to do? I'm going to use my air saw. I got this little nice air saw. I got some metal bits for it. So I'm going to try using that. Well, as you'll see, I start cutting the first one. It doesn't really work all that well. The bit gets, or like the blade gets stuck. It doesn't move. I'm just having a hell of a time with it. It's not really cutting like I expect it to. So, the long and short of it is like it seemed to be good for like the first few cuts, but it wasn't working as well as I would have hoped. The blade just popped out. So anyways, I'm eventually going to get tired of dicking around with this and just pull out my grinder with a cutoff wheel. I know that's gonna work. I got my battery operated one, so it makes it a little bit nicer. But then I was like, I'm just going to grab my corded one because, I'm going to be cutting on here for a long time. So I will use my corded grinder for doing the cuts, and then I'll use my cordless for just like grinding and cleaning up. It makes most sense to me. I love the battery operated tools, but when you're doing big long jobs, it just drains the battery so quick. They don't have enough time to charge. So by switching over to the corded, I will make my life a little bit easier. I'm making sure to be super careful around the cage because I do not want to cut into the cage. I mean, the reality is I could just weld it and it wouldn't be a big deal. I'll blend it in, no one would know. But, you know, if I can avoid cutting into the cage, yeah, I'm going to avoid cutting into it. If it takes a little bit more time, I mean, it's worth it. So as I was cutting all this out, you'll notice I take my camera out and take some pictures. If you're following me on Instagram, I was going to make a joke like, oh, I cut all this roof material out just to inspect the welds on top of the cage. And I actually found that I was missing some welds around the top halo bar. And, well, I guess it was actually around the front down bar, but it wasn't fully welded all the way around. I couldn't believe it. I was like, I thought I had this thing fully welded. Like, I thought when I did the cage, I welded the whole thing all the way around. I did not. So it is a good thing that I'm coming in here to do this roof so I can get those welds fully done. Yeah, so it was at this point in time I realized I'm a bit of an idiot. I should have taped off the inside of the windows as well, not just the outside. So I'm going to take it, 10-15 minutes here and tape off the inside of both windows, and then I think I taped off the outside of the driver's side as well. But I've already sent tons of sparks to both of these windows. As you can see, there is just a absolute ton of work that is going into getting prepped for my new roof. And, you know, with that also comes a massive mess. The amount of sparks and metal dust and just everything else that's come off of this is just extraordinary. I mean, it's no different than any of the other metal work that I've done when I cut out the rear torque boxes. Like, that was a ton of work. You know, this is a ton of work as well. But yeah, it just makes an absolute mess everywhere in the shop. Floor, the car, like the carts, the toolboxes, everything is just a mess. Yeah, and if you've been on my channel for a little while, you'll know that I clean up all the time. Sometimes I leave it in the videos, sometimes I don't. There are times where I just, like, you know, first thing in the morning before I've even started doing anything, I'm cleaning up the shop, and that's definitely not on camera. But I generally try and give you like a sense of this is what it takes to do this work. It's not like TV where it's like, oh, we did this big retrofit, and then, like, you know, after an hour of an episode, the car is done. I mean, this work takes a lot of time. So the next thing that I'm going to start on is I'm going to install a new harness bar. So as you can see, I've got a writing on my halo there that says, you know, bar here. And the reason being is the bar that I was resting my hand on there is too low in the car. So there's NHRA specifications on how low your harness bar can be away from where your belts come. Because if your harness bar is too low, what's happening is when you tighten your belts, it's actually pulling you down in the car, which really isn't safe. You want it pulling you back in the car. So with the harness bar where it was, the speed I was running, the tracks I was running at, it was okay. And for the street, it was fine. But, you know, as I go faster and yeah, as I go faster, the risk for things to happen increases. So I want to make sure I'm as safe as possible in the car. That's always been my number one thing. I want to be safe. When I initially put the cage in, I didn't realize that the harness bar mattered. I just kind of watched the installation video and went with it. Oh, that's where they've got it, so that's where I'll put it. But I've got seat brackets, I've got seat sliders, so my seat actually sits up quite a bit higher. If I slammed the seat on the ground, it would probably actually be perfect. So that being said, I have a new bar. At first, I wasn't sure if I was going to take the old bar out or leave it in. Right now I've got the mounting bracket or the bracket for my electronics panel in there. I've got the bracket for my USB ports in there. So I was like, maybe I'll just leave it. It's not the end of the world if I just left it, right? But looking at it, it looks kind of silly having the two bars in there. So I probably will end up removing it. And the reason why I should have made this decision before is I actually could have cut that bar out and then used it up top. Like, I could have just moved it up, so I would have saved the cost of buying this bar, which is like 40 or 50 bucks, whatever it is. So just I should have planned it out a little bit better. Should have just used the old bar, just moved it up, because I'm probably cutting the old one out anyways. But anyways, here we go. So what I did is I measured how wide I need it to be in the car. I set my angle finder on the bar that's in the car, and then I got the angle of the bar going up. I did a little bit of math to figure out what angle I need to cut this what's this called? This this is a miter. Well, it's a miter cut, but it's a why can't I think of the word of what this is? Cope? Yeah, I guess I'm coping the tube. Anyways, I found out the angle, so I'm using that, and we're just going to fit this in the car. So it's pretty important that I get the notches, tube notching, that's what it is. So it's pretty important that I get the notches on either side aligned perfectly. Otherwise, when I put this in the car, it's not going to sit right, and it's just not going to look right. So what I really should have done is I should have marked the center of the bar before I did my first notch. So that way, when I'm doing the second one, I have a reference point already. But unfortunately, I don't really have a good way of marking the tube right now. I'm actually 3D designing a an adjustable Sharpie holder for marking it. So, once I get that done, I'd be able to do it. But don't have it right now, so it is what it is. So with that tube pretty much all cleaned up, I gotta clean off the tubes in the chassis, and then it's time to get this thing welded in, because got the right length, we got the right notches. I'm surprised that I got those right on the first time. Hey, sometimes I get lucky. So I'm just really taking my time here in getting this bar like perfectly level to the car. You know, if this thing was even off 1 degree, nobody would really notice. You know, I might, but I would also know it's that off. But, you know, if I'm like half a degree off, I'd you know, that'd be fine. But, you know, I just decided I'm going to really take my time, be like 0.1 or 0 if possible. And, you know, it took a lot of effort and time to actually get that, but you know, I'm really happy with the end results. right about now, you might be wondering, why am I drilling holes in my tubes? So the reason why I'm drilling a hole in several of the tubes here is when you weld on a tube, that tube gets hot. All of the air in that tube expands. If there is nowhere for that air to go, what's going to happen is, as you're welding, that molten metal becomes a really weak spot. So all of the pressure that's inside that tube is going to find the weakest point. And, you know, solid steel is not weak. Molten steel is very weak. So what's going to happen is, as you're welding, all that pressure builds up, and it needs to go somewhere. So it goes to where you're welding and just punches a hole right through where you're welding to get all of the pressure out of the tube. So what you do is, if the tube is fully like enclosed end to end, like my halo is, like this bar is gonna be, like there's gonna be no escape on either end, what you gotta do is you gotta drill a tiny little, like not even an 1/8 inch hole, just like a small little hole, do your welding. And then once everything is fully cooled down, what you can do is go back and weld over those holes, because it takes a little bit of time for enough pressure to build up in those tubes for it to actually blow out. So you can probably weld for, 5 or 10 seconds pretty safely. So what you got to do is get in there, get it hot, melt it, get your filler in there, close that hole off, and then when everything cools down, you're good to go. So I figured, well, while I've got the TIG welder out, I do have other places on the cage that I missed. So on the driver's side triangulation bar, I missed a chunk in there. I don't think I've fixed the main hoop part yet. So, I got the welder out. I might as well do all of the welding I need to do while it's already out. I don't want to forget again. All right, it is time to take a massive chunk out of this firewall. So what am I doing? What's the plan? Well, when I went up to Port Alberni for Thunder in the Valley this past summer, I had some holes in my firewall. I know that won't pass tech, so I just kind of epoxied them on there just to, pass tech and make it look like this isn't a death trap. It's not, but, want to play by the rules. There's a reason why they want a firewall closed. If there's ever a fuel leak and that comes into the cab, it could be not having holes in your firewall could be the difference between you living and dying. It's a sad reality, but it's the truth, right? Like, my fuel pressure regulator is right there. If a fuel line burst, my header's right there. So if that started puking fuel into the engine or into the passenger compartment, that would have potentially been really bad. So patch those holes. But this firewall has, a ton of other holes in it. When I did the some patchwork for the hydraulic clutch, that looked like crap, but got me through the summer. So now I'm going to replace a bunch of this metal in the firewall. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to 3D scan it. I'm going to draw up some pieces on the computer. And we're just going to work through this. This is also going to save me a bit of room. All those ridges in the engine bay took up room. I think I gained like 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but when, I've got my engine back a little bit tighter than stock, all the room in the world helps. Also, I'm pulling that lip out of there because, it just looks kind of ugly, and I think it'll look better with that lip removed. Also, if I, with that lip removed, I want to mount coil brackets right there. I can do that. I've got options with that lip gone. So this is kind of like the first really big piece I've done on the plasma cutter. I did run into some issues where it just didn't cut fully. It's just kind of annoying me. But it cut enough that I was able to just use a die grinder and get it out of there. And it was fine. Alright, first look at it. in the car. I'm pretty happy with this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some layout dye, put that on the firewall, and then I'm going to scratch out the pattern, and I'm going to start cutting. I'm not going to talk too much more, I don't think. It's just doing fab work. I've done fab work before, and I've talked about it. This is really no different. Cut it out, grind it, make it fit, and then weld it in. So I was a little too aggressive when I was cutting out the old plates, and I actually cut up into the cowl area. Now the cowl area is where all the wiper motor linkage sits, and that is directly above the passenger compartment. So what happened was I cut into it on the left side there, right where I'm kind of right at the top area there. And so I need to just go in there and I need to fix it. So you can kind of see there's a hole right above where I was just cutting. And so that's the cowl area. That's where, if it's raining, there's going to be a ton of water getting right in that area. So I'm just kind of pushing the metal together. I'm going to weld it. I'll dump some water in there. I realized that I hadn't done good enough, so I go back, I do some more. And another thing is, when I was cutting this plate area out, I was pretty what's the word I'm looking for? I was fairly generous with my cuts, and so my gaps are way bigger than I want. So after I do all this welding, you'll see I actually cut out another plate that's sized better, and then I take my time and fit it better. I should have done that the first time. I wasted a bunch of metal. Kind of stupid. I know better. I know I need to just slow down, because now I'm doing the work twice, but apparently I just don't learn sometimes. yeah, so here I am. I'm re-3D scanning that area because, as I mentioned, I was way too generous with my initial cuts, so I need to cut out a new piece. So I'm going to rescan it, and then I'll go back to the computer, redraw out the pieces, and then re-plasma cut out a new plate. right, well folks, with this first piece kind of just sitting there on its own, I got all the fitment up pretty nice. That is all the time we have for this week. So as always, if you've stuck around this long, I'd like to thank you for viewing, and we'll see you in the next one.